Continuing in the words of Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, we're skipping now to the Dayenu, which is that if Hashem would have done this and not done that, the Dayenu would have been enough. So he says, if Hashem would have just destroyed our enemies, but not given us the wealth, not given us the great wealth, that would have been enough. So he asked the following question. We know that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the bris bein habasarim, he gave the famous nevuah to Avram Avinu, that they're going to go into a nation, they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. When they're going to leave with rechush gadol, they're going to leave with a tremendous amount of wealth. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu already promised Klal Yisrael that when they leave Mitzrayim, they're going to leave with an enormous amount of wealth. So how is it possible that the Haggadah could say that if Hashem would have just destroyed our enemies and not given us a lot of wealth, the rechush gadol, Dayenu would have been enough? He has to give us an enormous amount of wealth because he promised he's going to give it to Avram Avinu. So he says over a beautiful mashal from the Dubna Maggid. The Dubna Maggid said there was once a merchant who hired a young boy to work for him. The boy did his job, and at the end of the week he calls him in, he said, I want to pay you, and he gives the young man a check. And the boy looks at the check, and he gets dejected. He gets very disappointed. I worked, and all I got was a little piece of paper. What's it worth? So he comes home and he complains to his father. And the father comes back to the boss, and he says, listen, do me a favor. My son is a young man. He doesn't understand what a check is. He doesn't understand the value of that paper is what's written on it. So he thinks he got nothing. I tried to explain, he doesn't understand. Do me a tov, he says, do me a favor. He said, my son's going to come back, give him a few coins, even if it's less than the value that's on the check, just to make him happy that he feels that he's walking away with something. Says the Dubna Maggid, the same thing was by Yetzias Mitzrayim. Klal Yisrael was promised the rechush gadol, a great wealth, when they leave Mitzrayim. But they didn't understand that the rechush gadol that they're going to receive on leaving Mitzrayim was that Hashem's going to bring them to Har Sinai and give them the Torah. The greatest wealth in the world is Torah. However, they were on the Memtesh Shari Tumah. They're on the 49th level of Tumah. They were so vite, they were so cut off and removed from the godless, the greatness of what Torah is. When Moshe Rabbeinu told them, Tavdin Elokim al Har Hazeh, we're going to go serve Hashem on that mountain, didn't mean much to Klal Yisrael at that point. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had but no choice over here to give them some of the wealth of the Mitzrim in order just to satisfy them and pacify them as they're leaving Mitzrayim, that they're not walking away empty-handed, they're walking away with something. And therefore he says, had HaKadosh Baruch Hu just destroyed the Mitzrim and not given us their mamayim, their money, Dayenu, that would have been enough, because that money he didn't promise. That wasn't the promise. The promise was the real rechush gadol, the real wealth, which was the Torah itself. Then he tells over here a Maisa. It says, "Ilu karlon es hayom." If Hashem would have just split the sea, but not let us but not let us through on the dry land, that would have been enough. So he tells over. They say that Rabbi Chaim was a fantastic storyteller, and he also had a tremendous sense of humor. So he said over the following story. He says, we know that for many, many years, there were a lot of chachamim, a lot of wise people that were very impoverished. They didn't have money themselves to pay for the meals, and they used to be supported by people in the community. Esenteg in Europe, it was that the Bachrim would go to the yeshiva. The yeshiva didn't have any money to serve the meals. So Esenteg, they would go to a different house every day for lunch, a different house for dinner. They would get the meals that way. Rav Shach, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, it was known that there was a tekufa during one of the, I think maybe World War I, where he sat in a beis midrash basically all day long and learned, and the women would come from the community, they would deliver the meals that he should be able to eat. The Chachamim very often were very poor. And they relied upon the chesed of the communities to be able to support them. So he tells over the following story. He says there was once a very clever person, was a very poor man. He didn't have money for his own food. And he was forced to depend upon the generosity of others in the areas that he was traveling through. So he was once traveling through a small town, and then a wealthy man in the town saw him, felt a little bit rachmanis on him, and he invited him for the meal. But this poor person was able to tell that the man was quite a miser. So he was a rich man, and a lot of money. They came home, there was a lavish table that was set, plenty of food. But he could see the way that the man was serving or not serving him at the table, that he was quite a miser and not so interested in sharing all that he had. On the table, there was a pitcher of expensive wine. And this poor man, wanted nothing more than to have a nice glass of that wine. But he knew there's no way that this rich man is going to part with even one glass of the expensive wine. So he says to him, he says, "Excuse me, sir," he says, "I have this delicious bread that you gave me. It's possible that you could give me a little bit of wine that I could just dip my bread into the wine?" So the miser, no matter how much of a miser you are, what's a little bit of wine? So he said, sure. Pours a little bit of wine onto the plate, and he's dipping his thing. Okay? As the meal's going on, he says, possible to get a little bit more of that wine for the bread. Just a little bit more to dip in there. And the man says, okay, fine. Pours a little bit more. And it goes on like this throughout the entire meal. By the end of the meal, almost the entire pitcher of wine has been finished by this man dipping his bread into the wine. And by now the miser is getting quite upset because he realized that he was taken advantage of. So he says to the poor man the following, he says, let me ask you a question. He said, why did Hashem have to split the Yam Suf, split the sea, make this whole miracle and to let the Jews cross through? He said he could have just called upon a few paupers, a few poor people, and each one would have dipped their bread into the sea, and it would have dried up, and they would have been able to go right through. So the man smiles and says, he says, it's a good point that you're raising, he says, but it was Pesach, and nobody had any bread. All we had was matzah, and trust me, matzah doesn't absorb wine the way that bread does. Okay, another pshat. Now that's the joke. Now the pshat. It says over here that when the Yidden crossed the Yam Suf, so they were very concerned that the Mitzrayim were chasing after them, and they were concerned that the Mitzrayim would catch up on them on the other side. So they saw, even though they saw that the sea closed upon them, they didn't know for sure that they were dead. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, part of the nisim that he made was the sea split them out, and they ended up on the banks of the sea over there. And then it says that there were dogs who came along and they began chewing up the corpses of the Egyptians. So Rabbi Chaim says that we know that everything that happened to the Mitzrayim was mida keneged mida, was measure what they did to the Yidden. Every punishment that they received was measure for measure what they did to Klal Yisrael. So he says, what was the mida keneged mida, that they should have dogs that come and start chewing up the bodies and disgracing them like that. So he says that we know that the Mitzrayim, the first decree really that Paro made was to drown all of the Jewish baby boys into the sea, because he had his magicians had their premonition that there's going to be a boy that's going to rise from the Yidden. He's going to end up bringing them down at the sea, and therefore they decided to drown them all into the Nile River. And then they would take the corpses of the children, and then they used them for the bricks in the walls of the pyramids or whatever it is that they were building in Mitzrayim. So he says that since that the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, defiled the corpses of the Jewish babies that they had drowned already, so therefore the corpses of the Mitzrayim, which were already drowned, ended up being spit out, and then they got the disgrace that they were eaten up. They were eaten up by the dogs. Then he brings down over here a pshat from the Rebbitzin. As we mentioned maybe the week before Pesach, that one of the unique aspects of this particular mishpach, the Kanievsky mishpach, is not only were there gedolim, generation of gedolei Yisrael on the men's side, but to have such a woman like the Rebbitzin, who was a gedola, I guess you would call her a giant in her own right. So every Shabbos and Yom Tov, nearly every Shabbos and Yom Tov, she had many women that would come to be with her, and she would give a shmoosh, she would give a drasha to these women to be mechazik them, to strengthen them in the importance of a woman supporting her husband in Limud Torah. So such an incredible mitzvah and opportunity that a woman has, she should do whatever is within her ability to help support her husband, that he should continue to be able to learn more. So during Parshas B'Shalach, which is the Kriyas Yam Suf, she would always say over apparently the following vort. It says in the pasuk that after the men went through the splitting of the sea, it says then all the women gathered together, and Miriam led them in their own az yashir, their own song at the sea. So it says v'ta'an lahem Miriam answered to them, Sus v'roich v'rama b'yam. It says that the horse and the rider were hurled into the sea. So the Rebbetzin asks, what does it mean over here that Miriam was answering them? What was she answering them? What question she's learning is that the women were the ones that were asking the question to Miriam HaNeviah. What question did she ask them? Did they ask her that she had to respond to? So she said over the following. The women understood at that point that they were going from Kriyas Yamsuf straight to Har Sinai. And Har Sinai they're going to receive the Torah. And the men are going to have the mitzvah of Limud Torah, of learning Torah. So the women said to Miriam, it's not fair. We went through Mitzrayim, we went through the Sheba, we went through the slavery as well. We're going through all these signs and the wonders and the Nisim. We're part of Klal Yisrael. So we're going to go to Har Sinai, we're going to receive the Torah, the men are going to be commanded to learn, and we're not going to get to learn. So then what schusim, what merits, and what reward are we going to have? So Miriam answered, Sus v'roich v'rama b'yam. The horse and its rider were hurled into the sea. So the Rebbetzin asked, and this is what she was understanding, that this is what Miriam HaNeviah was answering to them. She said, okay, I understand, the Mitzvah were Rishoyim. They were wicked people. They made the lives of the Yidden miserable all those years in Mitzrayim. They deserve to be hurled into the sea. What did the horses do wrong? Why did the horses have to get drowned together with the rider in the sea? The horse is a horse. He didn't do that much. So she said, you see from here that even if in the world of the horse, whose kavanah wasn't to lead the Mitzrayim in the battle against Klal Yisrael, however, they were being used to facilitate the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, to be able to go and do their atrocities and try to kill the Jewish people. So if you're being used to help somebody do something, so what the punishment is for that person, you're going to get a punishment for helping them to do that aver that they did. So Miriam said, on the other hand, since that midah taiva, that a good thing is maruba, is much better than a bad thing. So imagine then, if you're helping someone do something good, you're helping somebody do mitzvahs, imagine how much reward you're going to get. So she was telling the women, you're right that the men will have the mitzvah of limud Torah. True, that's how it's going to be. Nevertheless, if you will facilitate, and you will encourage, and you will help, and you will inspire and be enthusiastic to have your husband sit and learn Torah, so then you will get the schar as being the one that was helping them all along the way. You'll get the reward as well. And therefore, that's what she's saying. That's the pshat, the pasuk over here. That what was Miriam answering them, she was responding to their question, and the answer is a lesson for all generations, that even if you're not doing the mitzvah, but you're helping other people to do the mitzvah, so you get a reward, you get a schar as well. Okay, we'll stop here today. We'll try to continue a little bit before the week before Yom Tov starts.